Farmer Tom here. Welcome to the Farmer Tomcast. Today on our ongoing series, Heroes of the Green, we've got Kari Boiter. How's it going, Kari?
Great. Good to be hanging out with you, Farmer Tom.
I know, it's been a minute. So the world wants to hear your story and your whole weed trip and your cannabis story. So I'll hand the mic over to you and let it rip.
All right. I've been on the front lines of the war on drugs in one way or another since the late 90s, about 25 years now. I got busted as a teenager, an adult actually, 18. In 1999, I actually was looking back at the tickets, which I've kept for some reason. I swear I'm not a hoarder, but I keep a lot of these historical documents and the things along the way as kind of a chronicle to what has happened and how things have evolved, because there's been so much change that's gone on in that 25 years that I've really been on the front lines of the drug war. So started with, being a victim of the drug war. I got busted 3 times in a row. I was maybe perhaps dumb, didn't have the best lawyers then like I might now. And like a lot of other kids, just found myself in the crosshairs of small town, rural America police. And I didn't know at the time that I was really a patient using marijuana for medicinal use. I hadn't been diagnosed with the genetic condition that I've had since I was born. I just knew that the very first time I ever tried marijuana, it made me feel a lot better than just emotionally lifted. It made my body feel good. It made the pain go away. And that's not in an emotional sense. Like I said, physically, I've always had a lot of health issues since I was really born. So, but I was a product of the DARE generation. I bought into it wholeheartedly. So I really didn't try cannabis till I was 18, graduated from high school, and kind of went on my journey from there. I was in television news at that time. I wound up working here in Billings, Montana, where I live now, moving to Portland, Oregon, where I became a patient. I was on a whole lot of different pharmaceuticals by the time I was 24 to treat the different symptoms of my condition. And my doctor in Portland and I kind of came to a crossroads where I could either be watching my life slip away from me from being so impaired from the pharmaceuticals, or we could look for some other solution. And it took her a while to realize that cannabis might be a solution. And she wasn't, real forthright about it. This was 2004. But she said, I've heard a lot of people with your conditions benefit from this, and I'm not going to recommend it, but there's a place up the road where you might be able to see a doctor who might tell you a little bit about medical marijuana, which is how it was referred to at the time. And so I went there and I tried it, and slowly but surely, we stripped away all of those pharmaceuticals one by one until I gained my life back. And that was my real first experience with cannabis beyond using it as a teen and getting busted with it for a teen. I still wasn't an advocate at that point. I was still working in TV news, ended up transferring up to Como TV in Seattle, where I met some of you along the way. And it was when I decided that I wanted to get out of TV news and I really wanted to work in the field of politics, that I was introduced to Mary Lou Dickerson, who was a state representative at that time. And she was looking for a legislative assistant, and I interviewed for the position. And she asked me why I wanted to work for her. And I said, you had a bill last session about legalizing marijuana. And I'm a patient and I know some folks who grow, and, maybe you don't really know much about the actual impact of these bills. And I'd love to be able to help you figure out what legalization looks like. And she hired me and put me to work on it a week later. I wound up sitting around a kitchen table with Representative Dickerson and Allison Holcomb, who we all know now as the architect of I-502, before it was ever an initiative. It was written as a state legislative proposal, a legislative initiative. So it would go to the legislature and then go to the people through that, rather than a direct citizen initiative. So that was always the plan for that bill. And I remember sitting at the table with Allison and Mary Lou, and we had the conversation about legalization. And, is home grow part of legalization, for example? And I felt pretty strongly that it's not legal if you can't grow it. And, that was one of the things that ended up being part of Mary Lou Dickerson's proposal before the initiative, was home grow. Believe it or not, a lot of people may not know that, but the original precursor to Initiative 502 did in fact include home grow. It also did not include the per se DUI provision. So we all worked together to advance this legislative initiative. Me as a legislative assistant, Allison Holcomb as a lobbyist for ACLU, Representative Dickerson as the legislator, the first in the country to introduce legalization on the state level. Very bold. I was really blessed to be able to work with her and learn from her. And you know, the whole plan was just to get the legislative hearing for the education of it. You know, be able to bring citizens up to speed on all the data, the science, the, you know, policies. And unbeknownst to us, Dominic Holden, who was a reporter at The Stranger at the time, was working with individual members of the Seattle delegation to get their support for this bill. And so when it died in the policy committee, he really wanted to see that bill passed, and he worked with individual members of that Seattle delegation one by one to gain their support until we got all the way to the Speaker of the House, who was the lone member of the Seattle delegation who did not support legalization at that time. So that was, you know, a pivotal moment that was, you know, credit totally to Dominic Holden. We did not know that was going on in the legislature. We just planned to get a policy hearing. And as a result of Dominic's work to get that, you know, Seattle delegation behind the bill, we ended up getting a work session. And a work session is fundamentally different than a policy hearing because you bring in experts on the topic. It's not about hearing from the public, it's about hearing from the experts. And so we were given the opportunity to bring in a panel of 9 different experts on legalization from different perspectives to come to Olympia. And this was in 2011, the 2011 legislature. Simultaneously, just as a kind of disclaimer, the medical marijuana bill was moving through the legislature in the Senate chamber. We were in the House. Senator Cole Wells was the proponent of that medical bill. So as we were advancing legalization, Senator Cole Wells was advancing the medical bill, which we now know ended up being gutted by a veto, 36 sections of it by Governor Gregoire, who was terrified of federal intervention. But I didn't know then what I know now about federal intervention, couldn't have known it, just thought I was working to legalize marijuana, you know, believed in a tax and regulate model because believed that, you know, by taxing it, we could generate revenue for programs like Medicaid expansion or, you know, housing, things that are needed. But not knowing really the true implications of taxes once you do that, right? Which has played a big role in all of this. So we get this work session and Ms. Holcomb brought in 3 experts. Pete Holmes, Seattle City Attorney, was one of them. And another was John McKay, who was the U.S. Attorney at the time, who had prosecuted many criminals, but among them was the Prince of Pot, Mark Emery, up in BC. He extradited Mark Emery down to Seattle to prosecute him for selling seeds, something that was perfectly legal in his country, made sure to send him to the slammer for 5 years. And here he was going to testify in support of legalization in our work session. And I thought, you know, I wonder what it would be like to bring Jody Emery down to stand next to Mark Emery, the Princess of Pot, Mark Emery's wife, who was left behind while her husband at the time was serving a 5-year mandatory minimum sentence. And that is how it came to be that Jody Emery and John McKay wound up on the same side of the issue after he had prosecuted her husband. So pretty pivotal moments in history, really. And I say that because I was just as committed to anyone in getting this bill passed. And what ended up happening is that as the language morphed from the legislature to the actual initiative, 2 fundamental parts of the bill changed. One of them was the removal of home grow, which we now know Washington is one of the only recreationally legal states without any home grow provision. And the other, which was more fundamental to me, was the per se 5 nanogram DUI provision, which was actually 0 nanograms for anyone under the age of 21. So 0 tolerance. And I just really had a hard time thinking about passing a bill to legalize marijuana that put new criminal charges on the books that people like me could be prosecuted for. Kids especially, since I had been a dumb kid who had been prosecuted. And again, that 0 nanogram provision, it didn't matter if you were a patient. If you had anything in your system whatsoever, you were guilty of driving impaired from marijuana, whether you were impaired or not. So that is where I ended up becoming an opponent of legalization, which, you know, looking back on, it took a lot of courage, and it was something that my boss, again, Representative Mary Lou Dickerson, encouraged me, that it was perfectly acceptable to have a different position than her. That was one of the big learning moments for me, where we could stand in the trenches together, and yet we could come out with different perspectives, and we could both move forward, and we still work together after that, right? This was just a moment in time. But I bring all that up because that is how I came to be on a panel at Seattle Hemp Fest in 2012 that's now captured for all of history, known as the Great I-502 debate, where I was debating Allison Holcomb and Keith Stropp, the founder of NORML, who is a criminal defense attorney that I respect greatly, and never could have imagined myself on the opposite side of the issue from them. But that's how it came to be. It was about that 5 nanogram provision. And before I decided to oppose that, I went and I looked at all the research, all of NORML's reports on it, all the META studies. And then we got together a bunch of patients and a phlebotomist and a doctor. And we decided to test our blood because we really didn't know at that time what it looked like. Concentrates weren't really a big thing in 2012 like they are now. Edibles have never really worked for me because of my messed up digestive system. So I'm strictly like a inhalation user at nighttime, daytime, whatever the case is. That's typically what works for me. So I basically, with other patients like Rick Smith behind me, who's now passed, you can see the photo of him there. We went and medicated like we normally would. And we woke up at 7 a.m. the next morning and went in. We had our blood tested, and we had a doctor test us for all the field sobriety tests to determine if we were impaired or not. And my blood level was 10.3 nanograms active, a full night's sleep, 12 hours after having inhaled bong rips. So, I think any cannabis user knows it's impossible to still be impaired at that point, whether you were a naive user or a patient, certainly a patient. I very rarely am impaired, although I am often medicated, which is what has allowed me to actually be functional to the level that I have been able to be, right? So, we didn't take that decision lightly. We did our own research. It's not a classified study or something like that, like a real scientific study, but it was important. And it was a lot of the, a lot of the old legacy movement folks from Washington. Rick Smith was there, Joanna McKee, we had her patient blood tested, Allison Bigelow, many of us. And I was probably the least of the patient use, at that time. Rick had dialysis 3 times a week. Joanna had cancer. I mean, all sorts of things. And so I knew at that point, I couldn't back that bill. And I've worked since then to reform it, because we did all commit together, no matter what happened through that panel, that this wasn't the end all be all of legalization. This was where we would start. This was the beginning, and we would keep working together. And so I feel I've really honored that commitment along the way, when it comes to legalization and working with people of diverse backgrounds, differing opinions, to find where we can unite and come together. So that's kind of my legalization part of the story. From there, what ended up happening is, while we were passing these bills in Washington, back in my home state of Montana, in March of 2011, towards the end of the session, the raids happened here, the federal raids. They went after 33 businesses all at the same time across the entire state of Montana, simultaneous to a vote in the Montana legislature where they were going to look at regulating medical marijuana here in Montana, really putting sideboards around it and determining what the industry would look like. And there were, a handful of legislators who had a handful of friends who engineered this, and it worked really well. Not only did it, put a lot of people in the crosshairs of the federal law, they were all federally prosecuted, but it scared everyone in the industry to the point they all went back underground. Our industry was wiped out in a day. And I saw this happening while I'm over here passing legalization and we're over here regulating medical marijuana. And I didn't really understand at that point how the feds could come in and decimate a legal industry like that. And being from Montana, where, we are proud of our liberty and our freedom and our, free from government intervention, right? I didn't understand how all of the sheriffs of all of the counties allowed it. I know now about civil asset forfeiture and the share that sheriffs get in asset forfeiture. But at that time, I was just very confused. And it just so happened to be that Representative Dickerson was, had served her 18th term in the legislature. And she built up all these programs as the chair of Health and Human Services and eventually appropriations. And we had a budget deficit those 3 years I worked for her. And every program she had built was wiped out one by one by one. And so she decided to retire from there. She had done, an amazing thing, many amazing things, and went on to do other things. And I thought to myself at that time, okay, who else do I want to work for in this legislative body? And I looked around and there was not a single person like Mary Lou Dickerson. And I thought to myself, well, why is that? Why are there lawmakers who would only let their legislative assistants run calendars or respond to emails, not teach them how to write bills? Why aren't there mentors like that? And why aren't there people like me in the legislature to make that happen? And I realized it's because people like me don't run for the legislature, right? They don't run for the legislature because I have a criminal background. People like me don't run for the legislature because I don't have any sort of formal education. They don't run for the legislature if they're women. Women have to be asked on average 7 times to run before they're convinced they're actually qualified to run, which has nothing to do with qualifications and everything to do with our society. And so I decided then, okay, I think the path I want to take is someday I'm going to run for office. I knew at that point. And I also knew I didn't want to work for any other lawmaker in the legislature. And I wanted to take what I had learned in that 3 years and I wanted to apply it directly in the field of advocacy. And what really was the catalyst for me that went from those raids in Montana in March of 2011 to me going full-time front lines all the way to DC to fight prohibition was the death of Richard Flor. And in August of that year, 2012, as Mary Lou was retiring and I was wrapping up all the work there, he passed away. He was a 68-year-old Vietnam veteran. He was the very first registered caregiver in the state of Montana. He operated a company called Medical Cannabis with 3 other partners. So he was the activist, right? There was the farmer, the guy who knew how to grow, which was Chris Williams. There was the lobbyist who wrote the law in Montana, Tom Dobert, and a criminal defense attorney who told them all how to follow the law, Chris Lindsay. Those were the 4 partners who operated Montana Cannabis, and they did so with the intent to be the gold standard for the whole industry that was going to eventually develop across the country. And they did, in fact, have the gold standard. There were documentary crews that came in, Code of the West is the film, and they had the head narcotics officer of the state touring this grow, state senators touring this grow. All of this went on, and as they were touring this grow, the raids happened, and it was captured on camera. And Richard Flor died as a result. And that's how I really learned of the case. And when Richard Flor died, there was a protest put together here in Montana in front of the courthouse where he had been sentenced by an 80-year-old judge to this 5-year mandatory minimum when his attorneys had told him he wouldn't make it a year in general population. And in fact, he died 4 months into his mandatory minimum prison sentence. And I felt compelled, for whatever reason, to drive from Washington State to Montana for this protest. And I was, really trying to make sense of it all. And I called an incredible activist known as Nora Callahan that I had been introduced to. And I said, Nora, I want to do something about this, but I just don't know what to do. And she said, find his family. And so I tracked down his daughter, Kristen Flor, who many of us know now, and talk about a universal sign. I had moved from Seattle down to Kent, and she had moved from Tacoma up to Kent, and we lived about a half mile from each other. And so that's how it really began. I brought her in my car with her daughter to Montana for a protest, and we doubled the number of protesters with that carload. And I, looking back on it, I expected there to be, it was like a Seattle protest. I had worked with Cannabis Defense Coalition. We had massive hordes of people turn out in court. And I forgot what it was like to be in Montana and how underground, people don't protest here, right? It just doesn't happen. And so we came and there was, 4 or 5 of us protesting outside the courthouse. And one of the people protesting was Chris Williams. Richard Floor's business partner. And he's a really tall man, for one, but he also has, a backbone, both physically and literally. And he was standing there stoic as, I'm got my protest signs and I'm chasing the DEA cars down the streets, calling them murderers, because that's how I felt at the time. And maybe not the most productive, but I did it. And they did call the police on us, and we were well within our rights. So, that was important too. I had Douglas Hyatt and Jeffrey Steinborn, incredible attorneys that I'm blessed to have had at my back every moment of my activism. So they told me exactly what I could and couldn't do, and we followed those rules. And the feds called the police twice on us and sent them packing. And the entire time, Chris Williams stood there, just tall, unafraid, courageous, knowing he was going to go on trial in that courthouse 3 weeks later.